This video is going to cover how I'm scaling my damage still on a shoestring budget by pushing monster resistance into massive negative values. I will cover the math behind it and how we can set this up basically for free. And before we get into this, I should touch on the hotfix, which nerfed a lot of builds, including a popular cast on freeze setup. Now, if you're thinking about switching to another Sorceress build, Spark has been untouched by these changes. In fact, we did get a slight buff from the hotfix in that block is now omnidirectional. So before we could only block hits to our face. Now we're blocking half of all hits no matter where they come from. And honestly, we'll probably be blocking even more than half of the hits once we decide to invest further into the character. If you're interested in swapping to the stun-based Spark build, which honestly is going to probably feel pretty comfortable if you're coming from a freeze setup, there is a playlist in the video description which goes from League start all the way up to the present. The one piece of gear you're going to need for stun is the Katako's current glove, which costs around 10 exalted orbs at the moment, and everything else can be scraped by with absolute bare bones rare gear. Now, to understand what's at play here, I want to give you guys a brief lesson on monster resistances and how they're impacted by penetration, exposure, and minus res. Bosses in the endgame can have up to 75% LE res, or possibly all the way down to 0. If a monster has 0 resistance, they take exactly that amount of LE damage, and if they have 75% resistance, that means they're only taking 25% of the damage we're dealing. Now, if we push that value into the negatives, let's say negative 5% resistance, so we're lowering them past 0, that means they're taking 5% increased damage. Penetration always happens first in the calculations, and that cannot reduce monsters' values below 0. So penetration is objectively the worst out of penetration, exposure, and minus res. Also, penetration only works on the hit, which means it doesn't increase our ailment threshold. However, exposure and minus res will work for ailments, so if we're using these, we're going to have bigger shocks, bigger freezes, bigger electrocute, etc., etc. So the way we want to scale is we're going to be scaling purely exposure and minus res through a few different factors in order to push monster resistances into negative 100 territory. Alright, now we're at the part of the video where I show you guys exactly what we have to do to get the negative 105 debuff on all enemies. It starts off with conductivity, which is a curse, where at level 17 we have negative 35 debuff onto the enemy's lightning res, and this can be improved even further through gem levels. It's affected by plus levels on our wand as well as our amulet if you have that, and we can also GCP it to get 10% increased effect. So in a min-max version, you're going to have significantly more than 35% effect. We're going to be scaling 35% effect through heightened curse. So 35 times 1.25 gives us a total conductivity value of 43%. The focus curse link just helps with making this feel a little bit better to cast. You throw it on the ground and it curses enemies quicker. And Hex Bloom it's not useful for bossing, but it just makes it so when you kill enemies that are cursed, the curse will actually spread onto more enemies without having to recast it, so it's pretty good quality of life. So this is the first 43% of the 105 we're going for. The majority of the rest is, well, all the rest is through Orb of Storms with lightning exposure. Alright, so this is a utility spell where you need to stand within the Orb of Storms radius in order for it to cast very fast. Lots of lightning damage. And we are using this to inflict lightning exposure. Lightning exposure causes enemies by default to have minus 20 of that specified resistance. And it needs to shock to be able to inflict the exposure. However, we're already lowering monster resistances by 43% through conductivity, and that is making our ailments much more powerful, so this Orb of Storms is going to have a much higher chance to shock. We're also using conduction support to give it an additional 100% more chance to shock. So this is very easily going to be able to apply lightning exposure. We're also using controlled destruction to increase its damage so that we will, again, generate that lightning exposure. no matter the target, no matter how tanky it is, we have so much scalability for our shock. The final node is strip away, and this increases the effect of our exposure by 30%. However, we're not actually exposing 20% because I recommend taking, for your third ascendancy, Scouring Winds, which lowers affected enemies by 20% more, or by a additional 20%. So that means our exposure is actually negative 40 lightning res, and that negative 40% is going to be scaled by all additional scalars to our exposure. So we did have the strip away, which is 30%. We're also going to go for electric amplification, which is 25% increased effective lightning exposure. So that is going to be a 40% value multiplied by 55%. So we have 62% lightning exposure coupled with 43% minus resistance through the conductivity curse. I think a frequently asked question is going to be, should we scale penetration at all for this build? And the short answer is no, because we have over negative 75% through exposure and conductivity. The penetration is going to do absolutely nothing for bosses or hard content. However, we are, just by the nature of pathing towards electric amplification, getting 6% pen, 6% pen, and 18% pen. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, because realistically speaking, we are not going to be casting the Orb of Storms as well as the Curse on every single monster in the map. Probably only going to be doing it a few times for the tanky rares and for the map boss. So this is just going to help clear the trash in the map a little bit faster. Although you could make the argument possibly for unspecking these 3 nodes if you're truly min-maxing and you need to find some nodes elsewhere and you don't mind losing a little bit of exposure. All right, that was the video. I should be live later streaming this build. We've made it all the way to red maps. I haven't been streaming quite so consistently because I've been having computer issues, but I think it's been fixed, so we should be able to have a nice blasting session tonight. All right, catch you in the next one. Peace.